You might have just mentioned it, but there's that interesting, what's it called, Real Democracy, which was Israelis giving up votes. Did you just mention it? Giving up their votes to Palestinians. It was like all over Facebook and the internet, where they would say, okay, I'm going to give up my vote, and then a Palestinian would say, I'm going to take your vote and tell them who to vote for. It was a very small minority, but it was quite interesting. Yeah. It was like inspired by a movement. It was in Britain in the last, do you know what it was called, the British one?
I have no idea.
Yeah, but it was where people gave up their votes to 3 different countries.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea.
One of the things to remember, so Palestinian citizens of Israel, they do have the right to vote, but within a very limited framework. And that is that if you run, for example, because Palestinians can even run for the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, but if you run on a platform that says, I want Israel to be the state of all of its citizens, not just the state of the Jewish people, but my family and others who may have Israeli citizenship too, they can be disqualified. Because the minute you call for full democracy and equality of your citizens is the minute you are opposing Israel as a Jewish state only. And so there's, it sounds like a very creative way of challenging, and I'm really interested to know more about it. But it's also important to recognize that all the votes in the world are not enough to, within the current structure and limitations, it actually prevents that kind of positive change. So it really would be a kind of complete change of the system itself, and not just a question of votes. Other questions or comments if you want to share, if you, for example, Hisham or others from the student group want to share, specifically what you're doing or what people here could do to connect with you or anything like that, feel free. Is there anyone who hasn't spoken yet?
Yeah, sorry. You mentioned that you went to the West Bank. Can you tell us more about your experience there? How was the community's reaction to you, as a Jewish woman from the US, and how they responded, and how were your experience and feelings as well?
Yeah.
And I'm sorry. And the other thing about how do you think we should tackle the problem about differentiating between being Jewish and being antis, because some people when they criticize Israel just label them as antis or something just because they criticize Israel. But then when someone criticizes Saudi Arabia or something, it's no, it's not Islamophobic. So it's just this same thing about double standards.
Yes. So in terms of the first question, I expected that as someone coming from the United States, which is paying largely for the occupation and the discrimination against Palestinians, as someone who's Jewish and everything Israel does, whether I like it or not, is done in the name of the Jewish people. Someone bursts into a home wearing a Star of David and representing the Jewish people, saying that we represent the Jewish people. It was very remarkable to me that Palestinians were quickly, in ways that I think American citizens aren't able to, distinguish between me as a Jewish person and Israel's occupation policies. So I can say that without exception, I have never been, it could have been happening that I wasn't aware of, but I've never knowingly been discriminated against or attacked in any way for being Jewish. I can't say the same for being in the U.S., but by Palestinians. And then your second question was, about how can we counter this claim that opposition, legitimate opposition to Israel's oppressive policies is somehow anti-Semitic. So I sort of started with those definitions because I think those can be really helpful to expose this idea that opposing human rights violations and opposing racism is opposing Judaism, and to really turn it around and expose what they're saying. And that can sometimes be actually very effective. I've seen sort of the people who've been doing that kind of moral blackmail have to sort of scramble because it's been exposed. So there's that. You can refer to many Jews and Israelis who oppose what's happening and show that this is not about Jews versus Palestinians. This is about human rights. to be very clear that we stand not for a particular ethnicity, but for justice, for equality, for freedom. We're proudly anti-oppression, anti-injustice, that it wouldn't matter what population was being oppressed, we would stand with them. But the third thing that I'll say is and I once heard I think it was a preacher actually say to his congregation, if we were half as concerned with Palestinians' rights as we are with what our Jewish friends think of us, then things would be quite different than they are today. That on a certain level, we also have to just accept that we're going to be called names. And that's, okay, fine, we're called names. So to really not let it stop us in any way. And people who have spoken out against injustices have often been called names, and we know now that they were doing the right thing. So. Let's see, you and then you, the gentleman behind you, and then I'll take people who've already spoken. So.
Yeah, no, I'm just going to make a quick note on, the sort of conditional.
Speak
up. Can you hear on the back? Yeah. All right. Can you hear?
Yes.
Yeah, cool. And I just wanted to comment on the sort of condition, the anti-Semitism as a historical manifestation of racism, as opposed to something that people accidentally slip up to, and 5 years down the line you're Hitler all of a sudden without realizing it, without it being contextualized in a racist mass immigration reaction and poverty-based analysis. And what I mean to say is, a lot of Zionists level a critique against pro-justice activists because, you're essentially just masquerading your anti-Semitism with these causes of Palestinians, but essentially you're Nazis. If you go to EcoStream and stand outside of EcoStream, you will be called a Nazi by the Zionists. And they are fully convinced that you are a Nazi by standing there, and you're just masquerading. And it's quite interesting replying to that by actually questioning them on why, the Holocaust happened and why rampant anti-Semitism emerged in Germany in the 1930s, and it being, related to immigration, related to, more importantly, mass unemployment that was happening. That is not something that springs about in that level all the time. That was just my main point. But yes,
I'm not sure I understand. So explaining to them why the Holocaust happened, what would one say?
Well, in the sense that Nazism in Germany was a lot more of a reaction to unemployment, bleak economic conditions, mixed together with a distrust that a lot of people had from Eastern European immigrants that have flooded into Central Europe in the decades leading into it, and that the build-up of racism was. Sort of going off topic, but the build-up of racism was related to all of these conditions combined. It wasn't like a conspiratory, what's the word?
So it was stumped up by a bunch of policymakers that abused their power to get the people against a minority people that was supposed to be the source of all the problems, which was completely stumped up and fabricated.
Essentially, that was what I'm saying.
The same thing is happening now, except the other way around.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, you mentioned in one part of the talk that in your opinion, in the U.S. it was an exciting moment because the movement pro-Palestinian was growing. Can you tell us why you think that?
What's happening in the U.S. now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you say European Union though? I wasn't talking about an EU thing. So just I can talk about the U.S. movement.
No, the U.S.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Great. So that's what I do, and I'm very excited about what's happening. So we're seeing the emergence of a lot of BDS campaigns around the country. I mean, the organization that I work for has for years been doing a lot of policy work and organizing communities to challenge our public officials, knowing that, of course, for change to happen, we need to change our governments billions of dollars a year of military aid to Israel. But also, or to complement that, let's say, boycott and divestment campaigns are probably the most popular way of people challenging Israel's oppressive policies, and in particular, historically, Caterpillar and Motorola were major targets. Now what's happening is actually Veolia is becoming one of the biggest targets of campaigns, and we have local campaigns really around the country, in Boston, in parts of California, where I live in St. Louis, Missouri, challenging Veolia contracts, and it's really quite amazing. So I witnessed, for example, in California, the local group was challenging a Veolia contract, and it did exactly what BDS does, which was that it got really controversial, and what happened is there was actually a sort of a town hall meeting where the decision makers allowed for the community to have their voices heard. And you had this group of artists and grandparents and students, this local group for justice in Palestine, calling for an end to the Veolia contract, each one after another going up and giving a testimony. On the other side, you had the Jewish Community Relations Council, who had mobilized 40 of their people to come up. You had 2 vice presidents of Veolia that had been flown into this little town where this little group of people was challenging a Veolia contract, and essentially it was the occupation on trial. The people on the different sides were testifying, and in the end, the people on the decision-making committee were not fooled by Veolia or people from the mainstream organized Zionist Jewish community. There were Jews on the other side as well. So what I mean to say is it was amazingly educational. It built up the local group. It made headlines. It did all these things that sort of traditional sort of film screenings or lectures and things that many people were limiting their activism to had never been able to achieve. SodaStream is becoming a really popular target with the Super Bowl coming up, the big final end of the football season, American football, and SodaStream actually bought a 30-second ad in the Super Bowl, and these things are like $3 to $5 million. I mean, this is the most watched commercials, I think, of the entire year. People watch the Super Bowl only to see the commercials. They don't watch the like really, it's like because a lot of really cool ads come out, and they bought an ad. I have no idea where they got the money to do so. But anyway, we're using it as an opportunity to mobilize. So there's a contest of people making spoof ads at the Super Bowl ad. There are house parties happening with social media, and then very excitingly, just yesterday, there was the launch of a boycott SodaStream national campaign that is interfaith, that involves groups within the Presbyterian, the Methodist, the Lutheran, the Episcopalian churches, and many more, as well as the Jewish Voice for Peace, as well as American Muslims for Palestine. What it is whereas traditionally in the United States, sort of interfaith cooperation, as it was called, was basically dialogue efforts where people from the different faiths would come together, but nobody could talk about Israel-Palestine because it made some people feel uncomfortable. And so this is a new model of interfaith cooperation. This is what real interfaith cooperation looks like, based on justice and freedom and equality, and it's happening through BDS. So these are just some of the examples. And I should actually mention that last year, one of the biggest things that I worked on was divestment campaigns of the Presbyterian Church and the United Methodist Church of the country, and for the Methodists of the entire world. And in the case of the Presbyterian Church, we were within 1 vote of divestment, which was tragic, and I still have nightmares about it. But it was also it really showed a change of the times that change is actually happening, and that is, it doesn't get more mainstream than a mainstream Protestant church divesting from companies involved in the occupation. And the same thing is happening on campuses. The same thing is happening in local communities, and it's just getting bigger. And a lot of it is modeled really on what's been done in Europe. I'm going to let you, because you've been waiting for so long, and then we'll
I was just wondering about your background and what you were told about Israel, Palestine when you were growing up, and how people reacted to your change.
So I actually was not brought up, I was not sort of indoctrinated with the traditional Zionist narrative of Palestinians are terrorists and Israel is Israel is heroic. The truth of the matter is that there was no demonization of Palestinians because Palestinians didn't exist. There was no discussion of Palestinians in the narrative. It was sort of assumed that we supported Israel in our household. And I actually grew up in a quite progressive part of the United States, in Berkeley, California, and I didn't hear anything about Palestinians. And maybe people were saying it and I just sort of had my ears off. I think there was part of that probably too. But my grandmother was a pretty big influence in my life, and for her, Israel represented like the only hope for our survival after she was a Holocaust survivor, and given what had happened to her family. So like these things sort of together made me feel an incredible allegiance to Israel without having gone through like Zionist, summer camps and a lot of things that other people do. I did also go on a Birthright Israel tour, and that like very much, of course, presents Israel as this magical homeland and without any mention of what it means for indigenous people. And in terms of the way that people have responded to me, I mean, I would say there's two people in my family that I'm cut off from in some ways, although slowly both of those relationships are starting to repair themselves, which I think really is not a coincidence that even the most extreme Zionists things are becoming more nuanced than they used to be. But I have to say that compared to those in my community that I have lost, I have gained so many more. I mean, through this work, I found a Jewish community that I relate to so much better. My parents are wonderfully supportive of me, if not everything I do, much of it. So I've been very lucky. Yeah.
Just because in the Q&A, anti-Semitism has been mentioned a few times. So if anybody's interested in perhaps learning about how the charge of anti-Semitism is often used to prevent criticism of Israeli policy, there's a great movie by a young Israeli guy called Defamation, and you can watch it on Channel 4 OD. It's called Defamation.
Did someone else? Okay.
Yeah. Also, further to this anti-Semitism point, I think it's also important. We can complain all day long about, or people calling us anti-Semites or self-hating Jews if you're Jewish or all that. But I think it's also important for people to note something which isn't really noted, that when you keep saying people are anti-Semitic who oppose you, you are actually going to put a very big cover and cover the real anti-Semites that are there.